Good day, everybody, and you're all very welcome to today's CNPS alternative presentation and discussion. These are normally held every 2 weeks. The intermediate weeks are when we can hold more general discussions on fundamental physics. But these we devote to particular subjects, maybe very technical or sometimes philosophical. So we'll be doing that today. Now, my name is Ian Cowan, and for my sins, I'm at present moderating these alternative sessions every 2 weeks. I'm from Dublin, Ireland. Now, we have a number of regulars who will be joining us through what we call the green room, and they will be able to engage in some discussion after the presentation with our speaker today. But we also have quite a number of people, many more people, mind you, coming in through the social media, the Facebook and the YouTube. And they'll be presenting a lot of comments, and they'll be discussing between themselves and among themselves things which we mightn't bring up directly, and that's fine. But if they want to bring up anything directly, they can say, here's a question for the speaker, and so on and so forth. My goodness, here's the first comment coming up. I have some gentleman, I don't know, he's probably from the other side of the world, maybe from the United States, but he happens to be in Ireland at the moment. He's in Ballybunion, County Kerry. So I was down in that part of the country yesterday, but I'll have a word with them in a moment through the media. So today it's my great pleasure to welcome a gentleman who is aware of our existence, and I think he has looked at some of the videos, but he's never actually directly spoken to us. He's James Arathoon, and he's based in Wales, actually, Aberystwyth in the United Kingdom at present. Actually, I got in touch with James, just for your information, through Harry Ricker, who isn't here yet, but I think he may be in soon, because James is doing some research with regard to the work of Alfred O'Rahilly, who was based in University College Cork, and has written this tome on electromagnetics. And we're actually looking at the archives on that. Maybe at a later stage, maybe in the autumn or maybe early winter, we'll give you a presentation on the results of our research. It's really at the initial stages, so we don't have much to tell you. But James has quite an eclectic mind. And in fact, one of the things, this is his first presentation to us. He's proposed, and you know, I've accepted, and I've discussed it briefly with some of the colleagues who are on the green room, that he speak on maybe a subject which isn't specifically on theoretical physics, but it's entitled "The Myth of the Hippocratic Oath." And basically, without stealing too much of James's thunder, I'll just say that his contention is that he understands that from the beginnings of recorded Greek medicine, he's going to look at this and how, in particular, historians, especially what might be called postmodernist historians, have criticized scientists and other amateur historians who write on the history of science without, so James would contend, being able to write coherently and rationally on the subject themselves from a scientific realist perspective, that is. So therefore, James will say that it's not strictly technical, but is based on work he's done while studying the history of science, actually in academic courses in Imperial College in 2008. And he also says it is in a small way, I think maybe more than a small way myself, but relevant to the fight back against irrational postmodernism and latterly wokeism, from taking over humanities and ultimately science and engineering subjects in our universities. Yeah, well, I just think anything sort of political or what mightn't be thought of as nice by the media or the politicians, that should be ruled out. We should be free to speak. We should be in a free society, not a sort of a 1984 type society. So without further ado, I hope I haven't made too much of a mess of James's description of what he's going to speak about, but he'll clarify that. And there will be some time available for discussion and questions afterwards. But I will say one more thing just before handing over to James. James has actually emphasized to me that he's an interactive type person, and he has no problem at all in being interrupted, during the middle of his presentation. If somebody says, "Sorry, should you just stop there?" He can tell me to stop James and repeat what he said, or he didn't understand the words he was using. So he's quite happy to do that. But if you want to wait to the end, that's also possible. So I'm going to bring James. We might have a teething problem or two in getting slides up. So you will just have patience with us. I'm going to hand over to James now, and I'm going to.
Thank you, Ian.
I better keep myself up for a moment, because if I bring myself down, you won't hear. I won't be able to interrupt.
So thank you for inviting me and your discussions recently on other issues. We've had some interesting discussions. So I don't know who's here at the moment. So I'm welcome you all. I can't see pictures of everyone, so I just want to welcome you all. And this talk, I don't know whether I can share the screen. I'll try not to do too much on the PowerPoint screens, but I'll just try and just give you an introduction screen. Present. Sorry about this. I'm just it's giving me a different option now.
I'll just come in myself. Just
so it's told me to upload. I can upload a PDF. I don't know what's going to happen now.
Have you got PPT or PDF?
Well, I've got both because I just something here.
Now, you see, I have see something here, but I don't think I'm able to add it to the stream. Oh, I am, but I've done that. I just warn you, I've done that, not you. I can remove it.
All right, so that's uploaded then, so you can do.
So the only thing is, you're going to have to tell me if you want me to move on the slides. Okay.
Yeah. Oh, I can do it myself. I think. What happens here? Yeah. So. Right. So yeah, this is the talk, the myth of the Hippocratic Oath, and it's just a basic talk on the nature of how we view science, history, and philosophy. I'll touch on religion, but not too much. Basically, science and religion have grown up in the same pool of thought, basically. So science, as you know, went one way, and religion has stayed in the compass of the moral and ethical world and how to live your life as best you can, etc., etc. I mean, science doesn't really, well, sometimes gets involved with that, but it doesn't really know anything about the moral aspects of people's lives. And although the new atheists with Dawkins and stuff attempted to get in on that, but they failed miserably, because if you just have a scientific world, a world which you have theories and you try and test them, it doesn't really say anything about history itself and how we've learned from history through the oral traditions, through the written traditions, etc., etc. So this whole compass of including thousands of years of human thought that's both brought to us by just one person teaching another orally, or through the written method. It seems to me a very, very what would you describe? A very, very narrow view. Although science is the most exciting thing for the future, you can't, by instigating science and fear of religion, to ostracize all past thought and or what people have thought basically is important in the past. So this is a discussion on the origin and philosophical natures of engineering, science, and medicine. I mean, engineering and medicine actually happened before, science. I mean, people have looked to find the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, for example, and they found them in Iraq, and then they found huge engineering structures going into the mountains, which brought this water channel from the mountains to feed what was the historic Gardens of Babylon. And it's quite amazing, the engineering, even before the Romans, the engineering, what would you call it, the expertise of the ancients. And it's very, I won't be talking about that, but basically it's I'll say something. Where you have an academia, say that that's very interested in the written word, it's easy to forget how knowledge in the engineering and practical fields are the skilled and artisan trades gets transmitted. It's not normally written down. You go into a trade and you learn things by your hands just daily and via the spoken word. And a lot of that information gets transmitted quite fine. You can find trades even nowadays that you can trace back hundreds of thousands of years, maybe, to the trade skills and the medieval era and before that. So we tend to, in academia or academics, focus on the written word, and that basically starts with my story, which is basically, I tried to be a polymath, but I fail. I've been interested in these things through my life. I originally got into engineering through playing with electronics and in computing, and I've done all these things and getting interested in one at a time. Anyway, it's not about me. It's just right. So classical Greece, and this is the sort of basis of where the modern ideas of Western thought, although it's at the base of more than Western thought, because it involves well, let's go to the maps because it's easier to describe it that way. I was going to talk about the early part, but if I talk about the later part, we can see. So the early part was 430 BC. So about 100 years later, Alexander had conquered large parts of the East, and so in a way, all our Western culture was transmitted into the East in what now is Iran, the Hindu Kush, and parts of India, Pakistan, all this area, and Egypt especially. I mean, the two mixing cultures there. So I'm going to talk. So in a way, it didn't come to the West initially; it went to the East. So all we basically say our culture is based in ancient Greek thought. Yeah, well, so is everyone else's. So classical Greece is this small little part of Greece where people go on a holiday. There's Athens there in the center. There's what was Sparta, and Macedonia. I think Aristotle came from somewhere up there, and so that was it. And there was some settlements on the what is now Turkey as well. So that was the classical Greek world. So I'll go back to this now. So basically, the period has a history. I mean, it's one of the first histories written. It's I have a terrible trouble of pronouncing the Greek words, but Thucydides wrote a history of the Peloponnesian War. Of basically lasted around 60 years. Sorry, it didn't last about 60. That's his lifetime. The Peloponnesian Wars lasted from about 431 BC to about 404 BC. So he talks about the great Roman, the great Greek speeches. So Pericles gave a great speech at the start of the war, and he died in what I'll talk about, which is the Great Plague of Athens. Well, it just didn't come in Athens, but it came all over the place in waves. So there's the plague of Athens. So it first came through in 430 BC, and then subsidiary waves coming in later. It killed vast numbers of people. Thucydides basically says that it wiped out large numbers of physicians. They call them physicians then, because obviously when you're a physician, you're called in to treat people who are ill. So they're the first people to go. I mean, I should make a comment on the recent coronavirus epidemic, and all the physicians hid away this time, so they didn't die. But in normal circumstances, they would be on the front line of all these things. And in this case, it was the assistants and the nurses and all the brave people on the lower parts of the health system that took the brunt of the early deaths. But anyway, the physicians were there taking their toll, and a lot of people died, young people. I mean, there's talk of about a third of soldiers in one encampment was dying. So it took out young and old. It was not really nice. And there's been a lot of work on trying to find out what this epidemic was, but no one's quite decided. I won't go into that because there's quite a lot of symptoms, and you could probably go on for hours about it. But you can read about it. It's quite a good description if you look online, you can find it quite easily, the history of the Peloponnesian War. So I've put on some other characters as well. Hippocrates, of course, was born about 30 years before the Great Plague of Athens, and died about 40 years after the first wave. And he isn't mentioned in Thucydides' history, but Hippocrates of Athens who was a Greek general, Athenian general, and he lived about over that time. He obviously survived the plague, and but died in a battle shortly afterwards. So he's mentioned, but not the physicians. He just mentions physicians in general. And basically, the characters who are associated with science that I want to mention are Socrates, who lives either side of the pandemic, much in the same age range as Hippocrates, and Plato, who's just born just after. It's not, the dates aren't quite clear, but he's just born just after the plague, and Aristotle, who basically came in much later. He joined Plato's Academy in about 366 BC. And what I want to talk about is there are links between Hippocrates and Aristotle, and they're interesting. And then, of course, Aristotle goes on to teach. He becomes a tutor to Alexander, who basically then conquers the East, as I showed on the map. So he dies in 323 BC. I've tried to put a few of the because the other major empire at the time was the Persian Empire, and I've tried to put I've tried to put on a few characters from the Persian Empire. So Xerxes the First was living around. Just get the. Basically survived the plague, and so he started these sorry, the Peloponnesian Wars were basically between Athens and Sparta, and they both had these sort of leagues of basically there was two sets of allies fighting each other. I've just put the Persians on there because they're always in the background. There are obviously lots of wars between the Greeks and the Persians. I wanted to just show you. It's just funny. This is what I like, these sort of things. So there's Xerxes who basically lives through the pandemic. Then there's Artaxerxes, who comes after Xerxes II, who's killed after about 45 days. Just reminds me of our prime minister who survived 45 days, and then comes another leader who survives 2 years, and that's probably going to be and this all happens after the play, So I just find it slightly funny, but there's several more, and then Alexander eventually takes over the Persian Empire and becomes the pharaoh of Egypt and all this and the other. So he becomes the major figure. So the question is, why did this all happen just then? I mean, what was most civilizations just go and plod on and everything stays the same. So my view is this. Oops, sorry. My view is that this is precisely because of this plague that the society of Athens is transformed. And my argument is, the early people didn't leave a written record because they couldn't read and write. I don't mean it in a bad sense. But the philosophy and medicine and things like that were transmitted by what you did and the word of mouth. Even mathematics was like drawing diagrams in sand. It wasn't written down. So Pythagoras wouldn't have written maths in a treatise. There would be just demonstrations in a group on the beach, drawing diagrams on sand and that sort of thing. So I don't want to be dogmatic, but eventually, at some stage, philosophy that was in the oral tradition has to move over to the written tradition, and obviously it explodes forth in the written tradition with Plato, and then with Aristotle in this period that I'm talking about, and the same with Hippocrates. We have medicine was practiced for thousands of years before this period in Egypt and all the other big civilizations. They were doing. If you go and visit major museums of medical history, we've got one in the Wellcome Trust in London. They have all these old medical instruments from thousands of years ago that have been picked up through archaeological digs, etc. And so there was obviously these highly knowledgeable people. And then suddenly, after this plague, we have what is called the Hippocratic corpus, which is basically a series of writings from about 430 or just after the plague till about 300 BC. I've got a copy of a cheap copy of Penguin Classics of a version. It's not a full version, but it basically has a summary of the most important ones, and it's basically a list of writings that were kept or started in this period. So medicine began to be written down in this period, and although Hippocrates, there's no evidence that he wrote any of this, and that's why I say he could have been illiterate and just be teaching this stuff. People assume he was. I mean, even in the ancient world, they went to his home, which is Kos, obviously, and they searched. I think I'm not sure where he had a temple or where he based himself. It was a family, because physicians were based in basically families that you were trained in a sort of apprenticeship as the children of a physician, so it was passed on that way. So they went to look back to find any papyrus records of his writings from where he lived, and they found nothing. So they, already able to read and write, they naturally assumed he'd burned everything. But that's the same assumptions as a great literary expert would have now. Everyone like me or of my intellectual standard must be able to read and write. That's obvious, isn't it? It's what we take for granted now, and but it wasn't true in that. And although he might have been able to read and write at some point back in history, they wouldn't have been able to read and write. So I want to put it forward, which is slightly dodgy evidence that he couldn't read and write, but I want to put it forward nevertheless. But it was very recent. It was to the period evidence they couldn't read and write, or the community with which he was involved couldn't read and write. I mean, the stories basically come in from Plato and Aristotle, and because I said he isn't mentioned by Thucydides, who did the main history of the period, but he is mentioned later by Plato and Aristotle and I can't remember the name of the student of Aristotle. But they basically, between them, they mentioned he was a great figure, and he basically taught for money. They don't explicitly mention he was involved in a plague. So and because Thucydides didn't mention it, I think he was came in after, because there was basically a lack of physicians, because they'd been killed off in the plague. I mean, as simple as that. People need medicine even if there isn't a plague going through. So basically, I think there was a period after the plague, and the government, the administrators of Athens, just took the view that they had to get someone, or he came in and he was popular as a teacher. Either way, it just happened. And so let me just. I've put some slides on historiography and theory and how, but I'll jump now to that to the founding myths. I'll go straight to the Hippocratic Act, which is basically the start of the the Hippocratic corpus, the stuff in this book, which is basically so this is the argument, or the start of the argument, that he founded Hippocrates founded modern medicine. And so this thing exists, which, so I'll read a bit of it. I swear by Apollo healer, by Asclepius, by Hygienia, by for health, by Panacea, and by all the gods and goddesses, making them my witness, that I will carry out, according to my ability and judgment, the oath and this indenture. To hold my teacher in this art to my own parents, to make them partner in my livelihood when he is in need of money, to share mine with him. So he's basically becoming part of the Hippocratic family, or a family. Well, they were called Asclepiads. They basically had their own sort of religious culture, which is never written down as part of this corpus. I think it was the secret part of the way they worked. I mean, don't forget, modern medicine now works to a large part, by I'm just lost the word. By the sugar pill. The basically, if you think the medicine's going to heal you, to a large part it does. So they have to test medicines against just the sugar pill, because faith and belief has a huge effect on medicine. And it's not surprising in the ancient world that as people believed in gods of all kinds, that healers naturally were better if they could make you believe that you were going to get better as much as anything else. So it's so they had a whole these people had a whole pantheon of gods, and normally people didn't have a pantheon. They'd just have a few or one or two they would pray to. But these obviously to have a pantheon, basically you appeal to the widest possible audience in your healing practices. I mean, they had all sorts of skills and everything, and that's all documented in the Hippocratic corpus. But I mean, when you really truthfully analyze medicine, I mean, doctors don't start making a real difference to people's health until till the invention of penicillin and the anti-bacterial drugs. So, I mean, they make a difference with certain surgeries and things like that, but to a large part, I mean, the success will be just the placebo effect. That's the word I'm trying to remember. Being old, I just forget certain words now. Every now and again, so the placebo effect worked then because of religious belief. Now it works through believing in a pill, and you might be given in a clinical trial a sugar pill, and it still makes you better because you believe that you're getting the 50% of the pills that are real, and instead of the 50% that are sugar. I'll just diverge here because it's one of the arguments I use against people who don't believe, or believe that a belief in God is totally useless. Because I've had instances where family, I haven't got young children, but where family, in my relation to my family, have a young child below 6 has been ill, really ill for the first time, and the illness doesn't go away. And it's almost as if they've lost faith that they'll ever get better. And how can you teach a small child, right, the clinical evidence is that this pill or this syrup or whatever you give them will make you better? They just don't understand it. So you have to give them something they can believe in, like a belief in God, or an object that's related to God, or something, a healing, or the point I'm making is that we perhaps need, even before we can understand the benefits of modern medicine, we need some little sort of carryovers that will help certain young children get into this, situation where they can't get out of their illness because their belief system isn't quite primed, or their belief that it will get, especially when it's for the first time, that will get them out of it. So that people might not accept. I'd love people to question me on that, because you might say, well, introducing a belief in God isn't worthwhile the consequences later on. But anyway, that's something we can discuss. Anyway, so it goes on. Some people are saying, what was the plague? It was some sort of boils and stuff. I mean, I thought it could be the precursor of chickenpox now, because now chickenpox is relatively, but it's got other symptoms that weren't like chickenpox. So, I mean, people come with loads of theories, but there were sort of boils and things. They didn't last long, and I'm not going to go into all the details on that, because there's so many symptoms, and that people have been arguing for years and years, who are much more expert than me on medicine, and they still haven't come to a conclusion of what it was. So anyway, this is the Hippocratic oath continued. And there's all sort of moral things coming in. So I won't administer a poison to anybody when asked to do so. So they won't help in euthanasia or relieving pain via euthanasia, nor will I suggest such a course. Similarly, I will not give a woman pessary to cause abortion. But I will keep pure and holy in both my life and art. I will not use knife, not even verily on sufferers from stone, but I will give place to such as are craftsmen therein. So these would have been the children of, born into the Asclepiad healing sort of community, the Hippocratic community. But his community was one of many. I mean, there were loads of different communities. So these are people who are born into the family. So they start training as you would in the modern apprenticeships, sort of. Well, in the medieval age, sorry, the apprenticeships in the middle, you start in as quite a young child. You get get given to a family or in a family where you start learning a trade right from a young age, and then as with the ancient Greeks, at the age of 18, you can choose, because you're not bound by your training. You can choose whether to stay in that training or move on. And in fact, Aristotle was one of these children who learnt within. He was an Asclepiad, or came from an Asclepiad family of healers, and obviously he is known when he was about 17 or 18. I mean, this is basically when a child comes of age or a man comes of age, they're well, because men and women are treated differently, and I'll come on to that later in age. So men basically were citizens. They could take oaths. They could do other things. They could vote in certain situations, etc. And so, but I will. So there are craftsmen within the community. So people have pointed out this is all very strange, that they're not, they're taking an oath, so that must mean they're 17, 18, they're not children. You can't give an oath to a god in ancient Greece unless you're of age, because you basically, that's the first oath you take, is the allegiance to the to Athens or wherever you came from, the allegiance to Sparta or whatever. So that would be in the first. So this is another oath, and it's only going to be taken by people of a certain age. So you're not a child being embraced by a healing family. You're someone coming in, and you're not given the same rights. So people have pointed this out, that it's not. These are not necessarily restrictions on the actual people who are trained up from an early age. They're a type of assistant class. I mean, I should point to, and this wasn't my idea. This was a guy, among other, Herbert Rees, spelt R or Rice, Reiss. His son, who I've talked to, was in about 2008, when I did my research on this, was briefly accused, because he talked about the value of just referring to creationist theories and stuff in school, and he was accused. I think he had to resign from the Royal Society or something. Anyway, it was all a big. Anyway, he that was in 2008. There was all big rumpus over nothing. They totally took his views out of context, and he was forced to resign as, I think he was secretary of the at the time. Anyway, his father had come up with this theory, which is just a small little article. Basically, was say the origin of the oath is misunderstood. They're just like assistants coming in and signing this, so they can learn from the senior physicians. I'll carry on. So there's some extra moral stuff, which is when you enter the house, you don't abuse bodies and abuse your situation. I mean, there's so much instances now of people in power abusing their situation. So they had a moral code, because obviously when you're a medical person, you enter a home where someone is ill, they're very vulnerable. So you don't want charlatans and people coming into the thing. Otherwise, it totally into the well, I'll call it a trade, because this is more like a medieval trade. This is more like a entering an apprenticeship rather. So this is signed before you start. It's not like when you've tried, because the myth is that this document is something that all the medics sort of speak out and assign to as they finish their medical training and go into the real world. Well, of course, this wasn't happening then. This, I believe, was just to solve a problem, because there was no medics left after the plague. So this was a temporary thing. Actually, the fact that this existed then, there's no evidence that this tradition was continued afterwards. Then this is isolated in time, which is another reason to believe it was just to solve a particular problem they had at the time. but it had huge consequences for the world, I think. And so basically, they finally make the oath. I'll just. So, I mean, there were certain different types of oath in ancient Greece, and this version. This version is a sort of promissory oath, as they call it. You're promising to do things, for fear of retribution from the gods. And the general structure is because there were other oaths were made for different other reasons. And so the general structure is you give a god or a list of gods as the witness to the oath, the covenant of promises to be honoured, and then some sort of sealing oath, sealing benefits and curses. So the last bit is to, now if I carry out this oath and break it not, may I gain forever reputation among all men and for my life and for art. But if I break it and forswear myself, may the opposite before me. So that's the sealing bit. So the full oath is there basically, and this would have been said. But as I say, this is not done at the beginning of a medical training. It's purely to enter the family of the healer's family, and to be treated as one of the family. But it's not a child entering. It's someone at least of the age of 17 or 18, that when they've gained the citizenship of Athens, and it's, if that's all where it was, that stood, and they were learning medicine, etc., that would be interesting, but not really revolutionary. Can I?
Sorry, anything the matter there?
Can I go? How do I go back to my main screen? Because I just
first of all, I was incorrect in saying that you'll have to tell me to put on your slides, because you seem to have complete control of it yourself. But if you want to stop sharing, you go into present, and it should allow you to do that. Maybe click share screen again and then say stop sharing.
Oh.
Yeah, working.
I will leave it as it is. I'm gonna.
Okay.
I can't. Right. Oh, so I continue. So if that was all because I've basically given you. Oh, right. Have I gone full?
No, I've done that. Would you like that? I can.
Yeah, because I don't need the slide now.
Okay. Tell me if you want to do that, or if you don't want to do that, and I'll just
okay.
follow.
So basically, we've described a period. It's a period of war, because just before the outbreak of the plague, Pericles, gives this sterling speech to Athenians, which presume haven't got to hand, but presume you've heard. And he says, we need to go to war and such. And then he dies in the plague, and then this other general gets involved with the same name as Hippocrates, and he does things, and other people. So there's war happening. There's plague or waves of plague, and then afterwards we see that this Hippocratic corpus is written, so that a lot of these texts are from that time period, just straight after the plague, or within a few years of the plague. And so we've got this idea that it may be happening and for a reason, because they haven't trained up enough or got enough doctors. A load of them have died in the plague, the physicians, sorry, and they've got to sort out the problem. Now, contemporary evidence we have is from Thucydides, and there's some, but only very little is from Plato and Aristotle. They just say that Hippocrates was a great healer and he taught for money and all this, that, and the other. But the central thesis of what I wanted to talk about is not there. It basically, when these people came in to the Asclepiad family, they basically taught the others, or the young people coming up, how to read and write. And this is my contention, and that this was the reason why philosophers like Plato, well, he wasn't in the healing family, but he was of the philosophers types, started to be able to read and write, because before that, in ancient Egypt, it was just the very highest elites, basically, who could read and write. All the tax collectors, all the bill, the bill. But it wasn't necessarily the philosophers, the tradesmen, because what I'm saying is the medical, the physicians were a trade, effectively, as we know it today. And they just taught their trade by word of mouth, by and physical training, how to do some healing thing or some surgery or whatever they needed to teach. So it's word of mouth and through training for your hands, copying someone who did something, etc. So all this wasn't written down. You wouldn't know that all this great knowledge was there, because as soon as the person died, it all dies with them. But it's carried on through their children and then arrives to us via a sort of history of oral and practical training. So at this point, why does it all get put into written form? And I say, I think that not only do they need the assistants, those assistants, and a guy called I'll just give you a name, Ludwig Edelstein. He basically he wrote a book on the Hippocratic Oath, text, translation, interpretation. He basically said he didn't give the assistant theory. I don't think he did. That was done later by Herbert Rees in 1994. This Ludwig Edelstein was 1967. He basically said, well, this oath is a bit strange because it's almost coming from a philosophical perspective. So and the reason why, because philosophers didn't want to get involved in death or cutting people up and that. So the medical people were used to death, presumably, and well, yes, they were. because they dealt with it every day. So they didn't have any these scruples. So why did this enter into the Hippocratic oath itself? And he basically said, well, it came from the people who were entering this bargain, because they didn't want to get involved in killing people or cutting people or butchery or whatever you call it, surgery. And so those restrictions that they were posing on themselves because they're a framework there, but they could read and write. There were sort of people who could read and write, and so they came in as assistants, and they did what they were morally, and so that was his thesis, and it was just forgotten. So that's a little background, and maybe it was true, maybe it's not, but there was just one other reference to to the Hippocrates and the community of physicians, and that's in and this is where I go on slightly dodgy ground, and maybe there's people who know more about this than me. It's basically in Aristophanes, a satirical play called, I can't pronounce this very well but it's basically the festival of the women, and it's a comedy that was written around about 411 BC. So if you remember, it's basically between within about 16 years of the first outbreak of the plague, that sort of time period. And I mean, this is my other complaint about people in the, I shouldn't say this, but I will say it. People in the historical humanities, sometimes they aren't able to analyze comedy. And I did warn that Ian that I was, bringing some amusement. But he wrote a comedy, and I've discussed it with one or two people, including a Greek expert. And basically, a Greek comedy was crude. It was their sense of humor was much more cruder than today, and they brought in all these analogies which were based on phallic things and sexual things we won't hardly talk about today in polite comedy. But basically it was all there in these plays, and this play is about a group of women who are praying together. It was a women only space. There's so much of this that has resonances now, because obviously women only spaces are under attack, as we with athletes, female athletes who have been recently been Riley Gaines, for example, a swimmer in America who was asked to compete against a male born swimmer and such like. So this is a play about female only spaces, which has huge resonances today. And I'm reading here the part of the Wikipedia sort of summary of this play, and it's written by a group of people or a person who's totally humorless and doesn't understand what's going on. So it's all about a man apparently, being asked to spy on women. So he has to dress as a woman to get in and spy on their sort of festival. And it's all these sort of the shenanigans that goes on around that, and the person is the man is found out and then is captured. and he's strung up, and there's various things happening. And in the process of this, I'll just read the bit that I noticed. Comedy, or especially satirical comedy, works on the basis of you set up one scenario and you introduce the fact that you're talking about something completely different at a certain point. So what appears to be they're talking about women, they're not talking about women, they're talking about people who can't read and write, because women weren't taught to read and write. They're basically the analogy for the fact they're the illiterates. And at some point in this, well, I think quite early on, the character who asked the infiltrator, the old man who's going to infiltrate the festival women, to swear an oath. And so Euclides, who's the instigator of all this, says, I swear then by Ether, abode of Zeus. And then the person who's going to go into the festival dressed as a woman says, why? Rather than by the community of Hippocrates. In another translation, it's the physician Hippocrates. So this isn't the community of a Greek general. It's within the community of physicians. And then the response comes, oh, I swear then by all gods wholesale. So and that's what we found out at the start. Is the oath of Hippocrates, that basically they ask you to swear wholesale on all the gods that are used for healing purposes. So if you go, I'm not going to read this play, but if you go into the play, you find out towards the end that all this stuff leads to this point where this character, well, the infiltrator is tied up and somewhat exposed, and there's lots of very crude stuff goes on. But basically, there's a character called Echo comes in, and he basically echoes everything. So, and this isn't mentioned at all in the basically. This old person is teaching the young girl, who's the Echo character, i.e. a literate boy, how to read and write, and this goes on. Of course, people didn't read quietly. I forget when people learned how to read silently. It's sometime in the Middle Ages or even later. Someone will be able to tell me that. But basically, that. In the ancient Greek world, when you read something, you had to read it out loud because because it was always done that way, presumably. They hadn't learned how to read quietly. So that's why you could spy on someone who was reading something. You could sit there. Anyway, so this play is all about teaching reading and writing to young people, and it ends with the young girl escaping and the old man, and it's somewhat sort of sets up a situation where people get taught in the what I think is the analogy, the Hippocratic community, i.e. the illiterates. They get taught how to read and write, and then they forget all about it and aren't grateful for having done that. Of course, if this was really about women, women weren't ever taught to read and write. They weren't taught to read and write until the modern era, and there was no tradition of teaching women to read and write. So this is all satirical on the basis of your using an analogy, and you wouldn't find it funny unless there was some deeper meaning. And I'm just suggesting that the deeper meaning was what they suggested in the play, that this is all about the Hippocratic community. And in fact, they did learn to read and write for the first time after the plague. And I mean, this is what. So I don't know how long have I had. I'll just finish quickly because I've gone on too long.
Yeah, as I say, it's completely up to you. If you want to finish soon, we'll have a long time for discussion. You could certainly go on for another half hour if you wish.
I'll just finish with. I was going to say other things about myths and stuff, but I'll just go about my own view of history, and we'll talk about the various theories of history writing and stuff later. But the sort of existing Hippocratic fairy tale, I'll read it sort of. Basically, I believe that all history is fairy tales, and people sort of have a list of narratives or fairy tales in their mind, and they fit one or the other to the history they're writing. That's why interpretation of history changes from generation to generation, because we have sort of a bigger corpus of fairy tales to choose from, and so quite. One example is, the body works in a sort of as a mechanical thing, because the analogy is that machines are, and all this. We don't have machines until when they're invented, so they can't be an analogy to how the body works. So there is a sort of growing sort of knowledge pool of applications of science and stuff, which then become part of our lexicon of narratives. So I'll just try and give what I think is a sort of current narrative of the Hippocratic fairy tale, I call it. The essential features of the story used to explain the foundation and growth of modern science or medicine from its indefinite roots in ancient Greece in the latter half of the 5th century BC are this. Pythagorean medicine flourished before the time of Hippocrates of Kos, who is said to have been born in 460 BC. He was a very gifted doctor and exceptionally virtuous man who believed it was important to enforce the highest ethical standards in the practice of medicine. Hippocrates and his medical students clearly worked to differentiate themselves from the rationality and delusions of other contemporary religious healers, mystics, and charlatans. In addition to the Hippocratic Oath, they wrote at least 70 medical texts. I say 70 because that's all the number that have come down to us, which we now call the Hippocratic Corpus, written 427 to 300 BC, so over about 70 years. These texts convince us that the Hippocrates founded his science on the belief that each observable human illness always had its origin in a natural cause. He taught that each identifiable illness can be uniquely classified in terms of its effect on humanity or on the human body. Once an illness is identified in this way, diagnosis, you identify an illness by diagnosis, the progression of the disease in the patient can be predicted from previous studies of other patients' prognosis, and if suitably if a suitable remedy is known, the illness can be treated and a cure achieved. Hippocrates plays his part almost completely isolated from the social, political, and natural environment in which he lives. This is because ever since the ancient Greeks first performed this miracle, Hippocrates has been a false projection of our rational and literate selves into a past that could never have existed. So basically, this is a form of which the postmodernists criticize historians of science and people of science for doing. Is basically they write history from their own point of view and ignore everything that wasn't part of, So we were discussing before the talk that the modern era of science is full of dark matter or things we can't observe, and this sort of roughly since the 1930s been growing, and a similar period happened in the 1700s with this substance called phlogiston, and it was a sort of imaginary substance that basically solved all our scientific explanatory problems. And then Lavoisier came in, of course, and started bringing in his measurements and real theory of energy, etc., all the precursors to the theory of energy, and then founded modern chemistry as a result. So, not to say these people were total charlatans, but they were just became trained up. Well, they were mostly medics, actually, because a lot of scientific people in the 1700s were trained medics. In fact, right up until late on, they weren't really professional scientists, and trained medics were and theologians, because most of the universities outputted medics and theologians, and they were the people who progressed science. So I'll finish there because I could go on and on, but I wanted to have a discussion. I thought more people would interject, and I don't want this to be a unchallenged sort of thing. But you get my thesis that basically the whole beginning of science is all bound up with certain people being learning to read and write for the first time, and that's what really changed society. And Aristotle being brought up with the medical training in youth. He had all this knowledge that he was trained in youth, and then he went to Plato's academy, and these two things, a love of nature and a love of philosophy, sort of banged together, and the modern world, was sort of created in his writings. And I'm not entirely created because he didn't have certain concepts in his philosophy, but he certainly trained up a person who was capable of taking on, most of the known world at that time. So there we are. Can I finish there?
By all means, thank you very much indeed, James.
So there's a lot of analogies if you look at this play by Aristophanes about all this transgender and stuff, because they were obviously it was all a farce for them, just to try and make an analogy between people who could read and write and people who couldn't. But for us, it's become a sort of a plague on children almost, because they're not able to evaluate what's right and wrong, and I think if you're not clear about philosophy, you can use compassion, which they do. They say, well, isn't compassionate to give children what they want if they're a bit confused, to affirm them with a gender they don't have, for example, and then when it helped them, and of course it doesn't, because they promise that a false model, because they promise these people aren't ill, they don't need to be treated as medical patients or anything. but then they proceed to give this scenario, this solution, which is entirely medical. It's a physical intervention. It's pills. These terrible pills that haven't really properly experimentally tested. So we have to be very cognizant of our philosophical history in order to not be taken up by cults and false knowledge, because as we were talking at the start, freedom of speech is entirely needed, because any one person isn't possible. It isn't possible for any one person to be totally rational. It only comes out through debate and discussion of really very thoughtful people at the end of the day. And of course, with this cancel culture, they immediately try to shut down debate, which is which is against all the sort of traditions we have from the ancient Greeks. I mean, Socrates, is the archetypal philosopher, and if you read this, is it reversed? The Plato, the Symposium, you start to, they talk about love, and you talk. This is the sort of thing we should have friendly debate, and the people there were had some animosities to each other and stuff, but in the end, I don't know why he was given a trial to put him to death. Well, he took his own life, but it was either that or he had to leave Athens, and he basically accused them.
Perhaps, James, what we might do in the remaining time, with your agreement, is I'll just indicate how we normally deal with questions through the social media. Then I might invite a few people up from the green room. We have maybe only one comment so far, but there'll probably be more. And then I might give you maybe 10 minutes at the end even to summarize everything and come back. Would something like that be reasonable? Because we have just over half an hour now.
Yeah, and people can talk about their interests, because we can try and talk about things that interest them in the present day, and how philosophy, an appreciation of the tradition of philosophy will help them. I mean, Hawking famously put in one of his books that was the philosophy had been put to death by modern physics, and of course that's just a philosophy. It's just a dogmatic philosophy that I don't need to think through what my assumptions, So we can talk about anything really.
Okay.
As long as it sort of relates to philosophy.
Maximize your interaction. Okay, so I'll just bring it down for the moment, please. And I'm sort of simultaneously a little concerned and excited. My concern is based on the anomaly that there have been very few comments coming in on social media. I mean, when we're dealing with, fundamental physics problems, the questions are coming in and the discussions coming in. There's very, very little comment here. I don't know why that is. Maybe people are flabbergasted by some of these ideas, which is positive in itself. And there may be some comments coming in. But maybe I could just start before seeing are there any inputs, and as usual, if any of you in the green room want to come in immediately, just raise your hand. But just a few comments of my own, which may or may not be relevant. Okay, comment just come in. He tuned in late. He doesn't know what the Hippocratic Oath is, or why is it seen as a myth? Okay, we can come back to that. Well, some observation of my own. I'm just interested, actually, just thinking about this maybe globally, that we have all these physicians today swearing by gods whom they believe not to exist, presumably. So that seems a bit anomalous to me. And the oath maybe appears to be concerned with, relaying information and assisting one's own teacher and oneself and the families thereof advancing this science. I'm just thinking how we're looking. I think perhaps, and you may wish to address these and maybe contradict me, but in the past, perhaps things were a little more by their fruit shall ye know them. Moses had to deliver as against the magicians of Pharaoh, I suppose. But nowadays we have, the churches were closed during the pandemic because you might go and you might be killed, actually. So you could go and you could pray to God, but perhaps he wasn't looking after you under those conditions. But there was no sort of contradiction or no even questioning that among the public. I'm interested to note, actually, that you also said, James, that basically the Hippocratic Oath was at the time a stopgap measure, perhaps, but now it's been adopted for all time. And just one or two other observations. When you were talking, well, you made very good points, actually, about the problem that historians, who are meant to be objective, they're meant to give facts of history and maybe analyze them insofar as one can using objective criteria, and not be emotional and not be fixed by set dogmas, which they then reinterpret history to suit those dogmas. This all sounds very similar to the sort of scientific, the quasi-scientific method that you have nowadays practiced, that we are continually every week or every 2 weeks in CNPS and other forums criticizing. So it seems to me that the so-called objective historians of today's world are behaving exactly the same way as scientists are. They're claiming to be totally objective and they're not. And one thing about this phlogiston business and Lavoisier and Priestley and all this, very interesting. It just occurred to me, actually, that's a bit of a reversal there, because the orthodox mainstream people now are frequently accusing dissidents of believing in a phlogiston. In other words, they're saying, "Oh, ether doesn't exist. Empty space is completely empty," and you're introducing something which we're going to dismiss now because it's like phlogiston. So this is complete. I just mentioned one more thing. I'm being a little sardonic here, but I don't know why the modern world now is not cancelling the whole of Greek civilization, because of course the Greek culture was based on the existence of slavery. So why don't they cancel everything and just say you're not allowed to speak about it and it's all banned now? Now, I'll give you an opportunity maybe for James just to address some of those points, and then perhaps we'll bring in some more specific questions. So have you any brief response to some of the ideas that occurred to me? Do you think they're balmy, or do you think there was something in them?
No. To take up the point about modern science, and that basically there's a as I said before we had a talk, Einstein himself was willing to criticize his own theories right until his own death, but at least since he died, which was 1955, about April, about that time, there's been a close down of debate, and so people have been called crackpots or whatever name they use to say, and a lot of people are crackpots. But I have a very specific definition of what a crackpot is. It's someone who has one idea in their life, or is taught one idea, and they remain loyal to that idea. Through thick and thin, through whatever the evidence is, is against it. So it does. The crackpots can be in the church, or in the university system just as easily as they can be outside. That's my view. So I don't want to. I mean, in this 100 years, we've gone. Or since 1955, 1970 in particular, it's the theory in physics which hasn't progressed. The practical side, the experimental, that's progressed. Perhaps it could have progressed quicker if we were allowed to have a debate on theory a bit more. But it has progressed, and we've had the James Webb telescope and all this, and all these new ideas are coming through from that, or the new observations. So there is progress. There is progress, but I found it amazing, and to go through, because I went in, had learned physics. I learned engineering physics at university, and when I asked about, to question assumptions, so there's this. Well, they don't say shut up and calculate, but basically that's the thing, that basically the equations are your instruments, and they've been found as if by godly decree, and you just churn the wheel and you get the results. And the same thing happened in a different way in the phlogiston era, because they had new instruments. They were mostly medical people who made chemical measurements of various sorts. There was a whole instrumentalist movement that took us through the 1700s. And then the culmination of that, the instrumentalist movement, or the measurement movement, actually consumed the phlogiston theory in the end. But it took a long time. It took 100 years. Obviously, theory, human assumption, can get trapped for a lot longer, because you remember Aristotle's theories. How long do they last? I mean, the core part of the church was all based on Aristotelism, Aristotelian theory, and in addition, because it was the Christian church was the Jewish tradition plus ancient Greek pantheons and all that, because they brought in the saints and everything, which are basically shadows of the godly community, aren't they? And so there was the Judaism has a sort of origin from the one God philosophy, maybe that came from Egypt originally, but they took it on and they made it something of it. And then the Christians had the Greek philosophy added onto it. Now you say, how can we cancel history? Well, that's exactly what they're doing, and in fact, they're following the modern woke people are following the line of Mao in the Cultural Revolution, because he cancelled all history of previous, and China has got one of the longest histories you can imagine in the world. Well, it has got, apart from ancient Greece, ancient Egypt. And with the Cultural Revolution, everything was forgotten. The teachers had to be re-educated, sort of in inverted commas, and it's almost happening now. But it's not a thing demanded from above. People have got themselves suckered into it because they've got no self-defenses, they've got no philosophy, they've got no ability to argue from two points of view or imagine someone else's point of view. And we lost something in our schools which protects or immunizes us from these sort of ideological takeovers. And that's there was an earlier point you made, and I can't.
That was probably the last point. I made a number of points, and forgive me for doing that, but it was maybe the moderator's ability to do this. I was just saying one could say it's Hippocratic,
but it links in with the cancel culture.
Swearing to gods whom one believes not to exist. That's what the Hippocratic Oath is. You're swearing to Apollo, etc.
Yeah, but they had a use in the medical science, because, as I said, that people didn't have pills then. But the placebo effect was through religious beliefs. So if you were, say, an atheist, or you weren't, there was no atheist then, but if you tried to be an atheist peeler, what you give people to believe in? it doesn't work. You can't be an atheist healer. It's impossible. So even if, and I'm not saying they had anything, even if they were charlatans, they would have a placebo effect. And in fact, there's lots of
charlatans. The point I was making is that the exclusive system of the Judeo-Christian introduction, if you take the initial part of the Decalogue, I'm the Lord thy God, and thou shalt have no other gods but me. It seems quite contradictory at the same time for, Orthodox Jews or Christians or Muslims, I dare say, swearing an oath based on Greek gods.
They don't. I don't think they edit it for modern times. So there's no real swear. It's not really an oath in that sense.
Yeah, I think that's probably what they're doing. Yeah.
I'm not criticizing really the medical oaths now. I'm just trying to make the awareness of where it came from, because they're trying to have a moral compass, and they're trying to connect that moral compass with the writings of the Hippocratic corpus, and you need more than that to justify your position. I mean, because now, which I don't agree with, bringing in, well, in Canada they've already brought in laws for euthanasia, and I think it's just a slippery slope, because you'd start devaluing the value of, even if they're in pain, you'd start devaluing life, and once you allow a certain age of adult to have an early death, you can't then say to a 19-year-old who feels pain more vividly as a youngster, well, no, you can't do it either. It all just, and that's what's happening in Canada at the moment. They're suggesting that the mentally ill should be able to have be able to, and it's all becoming a nonsense. Eventually, they'll realize that some sort of horrible massacre has happened and come out to their senses. But there we are.
Okay, well, I think some of the people in the green room may wish to address issues like that. But if I may, let me just pop in one or two questions which have been put in. This seems to be a specific one from Jerry. He says, Hippocrates was the originator of the 4 temperamental personality theory. Do you know that? Do you agree with that? I'm not quite sure. That 4 temperament personality theory.
Yeah, the 4 humors. Yeah, it was all in this sort of Galen theory that came into the Roman, because eventually Rome invaded and took over Greece, and then adopted basically. I can't remember his name, but he basically said that Romans came up with nothing new, and they just had a war machine that would absorb other people's cultures, and that's the way they grew. So initially it was with the ancient Greeks, and they basically, apart from, I mean, the Greeks were a bit more effeminate, weren't they, with the males, and they were joking about, femininity a bit more, and the Romans were very masculine in their culture. So there's a difference there. But other than that, there was a lot of, stealing of Greek culture.
And he's followed on. I don't know what this is. He said this, which is what the Myers-Briggs theory was based upon. Does that make sense to you?
The Myers-Briggs? No.
Okay. So I can be forgiven. Okay. Well, unless
Jerry basically, the 4 humors and everything went on until quite a long time, and probably it's still around if you look.
Yeah, Descartes would have talked about those. And
yeah. It's. I mean, they didn't know that how the heart was a pump until the 1600s. So, I mean, there was a long, as I said, there was a long period where Aristotelian theories were unchallenged. And of course, we all know about the Copernicus and the scientific revolution in that sense, and Galileo and all that leading on to the physics we know. But there were other things in medical as well that just lasted 1,000 or more years. And it's quite easy. if we point to the dogmas that can hold out, for 100 years with the phlogiston or things that are holding out, they're coming on for that time. What's the difference? If they last 100 years, then perhaps it's easier to last 1,000 years after that. So we've got to challenge dogmas all the time. Otherwise, we could end up with just a stagnant society. That's what I'll say.
Actually, I've been proved incorrect now because all the comments are suddenly coming in on the social media. I did put a note in inviting them, but I think now that your talk has ended, they're putting them all in. So
I did want to have a sort of because I love ancient Greek dialogues. I love the dialogue thing, and I love watching these because this has all come back, of course. Because when you have these long form discussions between people who have come from totally different backgrounds, they're really quite interesting. And none of it happens on the mainstream media, but it'll happen on the YouTube where people talk and bring, and it's hugely interesting. Two very clever people talking. I mean, I'm not one of them. I'm sort of a pseudo thinker, but I do like to think these wide thoughts, but I'm a bit too generalist to know about things in sufficient detail to be, But
I suppose these drugs were, or similar drugs were available in Greece. Jerry's asking, was cannabis and psychedelics available in ancient Greece? What would you say to that, James?
I think there were drugs. Obviously, they have alcohol and they have drugs. They had Socrates took the poison. They knew about poisonous plants. They obviously mentioned the abortion and giving people a certain potion to. So they know a huge amount of things about herbal medicines and stuff like that. So psychedelics and cannabis, and I don't know whether precisely cannabis, but all those sort of things would be known about. Yes.
Just one other point. This is interesting, I think. He says, he asks, don't doctors sometimes feel obligated to deceive their patients? And should they, perhaps?
Well, if you give someone a medicine and it's the chance of it working are very low, then what's the point of giving that medicine if you don't sort of try and create a sort of placebo effect? So I have no problem with doctors trying to egg it up a bit just to try and, because placebo effect is very, very, very extremely effective. It's very difficult to produce drugs which actually outbeat the placebo effect. So if you're going to deny the placebo effect to someone, then they would be better off with a faith healer, wouldn't they? So they're in a quandary. It's up to, so that's just my personal point of view. But that's not deceiving someone, is it, for false purposes? That's sort of trying to make the best of a imperfect world.
Very well. I think it's probably come to the time when we might get the people in the green room to participate. Now, I'm not getting any signs, although I think maybe James had at least one point he wanted to raise about pandemic in Athens or something. But James always has said, James Keane, some interesting points to make. So you'll forgive me, Jim, for adding you to the stream and asking you to make your contribution today.
Hi, James.
Hi, hello. Thanks for your presentation.
I'm sure there's more experts than me in ancient Greece, but I just wanted to put this new perspective out there to try and people to examine the history in a slightly different way, perhaps. And I'm not because I'm not expert in the Greek language or in Latin or these things. The people who are expert in that are the people who can do the real basic research that's necessary. But anyway, that's the point I mean. Go on, carry on, James.
Let me ask how this information about all of these figures came down to the modern day. Were there texts preserved in certain libraries, or what?
Well, I wasn't going to get onto this, but you can't help but get onto this because You know, I showed that Alexander the Great invaded modern day Iran, Persia, as it was, and or even before then it was. I can't remember the name it had before then, but anyway, so basically all that area is part of, you could describe as the West, because it all became part of the Roman Empire, and all these texts got absorbed into the Roman Empire, all these ancient Greek texts in Latin and Greek, and then eventually the Roman Empire falls, and of course it splits in two before then. So it has a western half and it has an eastern, the Byzantium in the east. And in the West, I don't know exact history, but basically the Christian side on the West didn't have such a high esteem for the ancient knowledge, and a lot of it got burnt and destroyed. But the heritage came through the written word, and not the written word, the oral tradition.
Oral.
So, and writing, or more modern writing. So there was some stuff being transmitted from the ancient Greek, but the real protection happened in the Byzantium, because that was taken over by the Islamic world, and they had a huge program of translating all these texts, because these texts only last so long because they're made of very ephemeral materials like papyrus and stuff. So they have to be complete. They're all, because there's no printing, they all have to be rewritten and stuff to preserve them. So they all got translated into Arabic, and then they come back in, because the Muslim Empire goes to across North Africa eventually and into southern Spain, and so it gets into southern Spain as a major movement of philosophy. I can't remember. I'm not an expert on this. And then when that gets turned over to Christianity, all these materials get reapplied into the Christian world. And I sort of have a sneaking suspicion that the stuff that comes via the oral traditions meets the real world texts preserved by the Islamic world. And there's a big, it's like, well, is this what I should believe? Is it, maybe that's different. So there was a huge set of questions. I think that's the reason why the West became so creative and everything, because we started, I think it was about 1200s, 1300s, when all this material came back into the Western sphere. It sort of created questions in people's minds, and that's why I emphasize that the Muslim world seems to have stayed in its. It wasn't knowledge. It was produced some great innovations up until the Middle Ages, and then it sort of stayed in a sort of quiescent state. But the Western world that didn't include the Arabic Empire there, or what became the Ottoman Empire, made this huge strides. And I think ultimately it was all about questioning, and that wasn't stopped to that stage by the Christian Church. Well, it was a bit because of Galileo and one or two others, but it wasn't. They didn't have enough authority to completely stop it. Partly because of the Reformation in Northern Europe and the waning power of the Pope. So it's a huge, complicated story that involves the whole world, the whole known world in that time, because the Americas weren't part of this. So is that sort of your understanding, or was that putting you?
Well, thank you for that summary. That does help me. Lastly, you touched on a wide range of topics and touched on certain modern age contemporary issues and phenomena in the social world, so to speak. I'm wondering, what is your take-home message? Like from this sort of cloud of points that you've amply made. What is your take-home message for addressing issues of today from this study of history?
Well,
if you could crystallize it.
My own philosophy of science is that, if you look at if we get to Newton, for example, who's the only real major figure whose system of science has been maintained as basically until the quantum world appeared, it's basically a consistent body of knowledge and logical thought. So, in my sense, we need to get to that stage. So, if you have isolated dogmas that can't be fitted in some wider structures that make sense, then it's not real knowledge. Perhaps it's always, it's ephemeral knowledge. It'll fall away eventually. I mean, the quantum world takes a lot of the Newtonian assumptions and keeps them there, but so it's not really a holistic new way of thought that is founded on itself. It's only just, well, for example, we say the atom. I will get to electromagnetics now, but the atom would, the nucleus and the orbiting electrons would completely collapse immediately if we took the classical world at face value. So we have to invent these new laws to describe what is happening and why it might be stable. But they're only a description. They don't explain why the atom is stable. They just sort of account for observations, a bit like the pre-Newtonian descriptions of eclipses and so, based on lots of circles and stuff. It's a calculating machine that works, but it is fundamentally dry from an understanding of philosophical point of view. So, and if you're not allowed to criticize existing ideas, then automatically it becomes a dogma, aren't it? Isn't it? And that's basically the whole point of this meeting group, isn't it? To basically to think on that possibility that there might be something wrong in our construction of modern science.
Yeah, indeed, that is so. Now, we're running a little out of time, and I'd like to bring. Thanks very much, Jim, if that's all right. I'll bring you down. By the way, just in doing that, I know you had some discussion with me, private discussion, which maybe we could have brought up, but I'll just bring it up very, very briefly. Jim just asked earlier, do we know the nature of the pandemic that occurred in the 5th century in Athens? Do you know what?
Well,
I mean, was it a virus?
It was a mixture between a pox and a flu because people had diarrhea and stuff. So it's very difficult to there might be more than one thing going on, so people have tried, but they haven't actually been able to understood it. So I'm not an expert. There are, if you search the studies on what it might have been. I haven't got the references to hand, but.
Okay. Well, I'm going to bring up Dennis. Unfortunately, Denny's he doesn't seem to have his camera on at the moment. So I'm not sure if he was at the very beginning, just before we started the conference. Actually, there. Look, it's happening. Yeah, Denny. Yeah. Maybe could we? We don't have very much time, but I'd value your reaction to some of the points, maybe as briefly as possible. And if you have anything you'd like to pose to James, that would be very valuable as well, just before we finish off.
Well, I agree with his idea that in the modern world, there's just dogmatic science, or we call what I refer to as paradigm protection. The physics elites have as a super elite the foundations of physics people. And these people have classical mechanics, the standard model, special and general relativity as their dogmas, and they're not open to correction. And they'll really get you. cause you to lose your job if you're in academia, if you even make tentative advances in the direction of questioning their dogmas, their paradigms. And so I completely agree with I think what he's trying to get at. And the only way out is if people change their views and stop being so woke and everything. And this seems to be something that they're not willing to do. It used to be that freedom meant the ability to do without being punished for you could to do good things, like you could get married if you wanted to or not. If you're married, you could have children if you wanted to or not. So freedom meant the ability, or if you wanted to go into physics, you could go into physics and study and learn and bring new points of view into existence and whatnot. But now freedom means freedom from reality. It means that you can say things like men can have babies and all sorts of crazy things.
Yes,
Many different genders.
A philosopher is someone who will just take that as an assumption and see where it leads, and it leads to some very nasty, dark places. Because you've got a cross on the wall, I'll just make the point that religion and science are not enemies in keeping a free society operating. Because the sciences, although they historically had these wars with scientists over what was right and what was wrong, they actually are intrinsically good part of society because they don't change very quickly, and so they have a stable knowledge base. If you look at the Catholic Church, for instance, they're still arguing about whether or not miracles in the Middle Ages were correctly interpreted or not. So they have a lot of inertia and that is good for society, because if things change too quickly, then we can go back to some values or some structures that work. So science is there to criticize and make progress. But if you go even back to just before the Second World War, there was this thing called eugenics, and it all got off in America, and it wasn't strictly speaking taught in universities, but it came along as a rider, and it all was involved in all the terrible philosophies that the Nazis used. I'm not saying that the same thing will happen now, but we should be aware that erroneous philosophies do get created every now and again. And I mean, just because you're a thief doesn't mean your child is automatically a thief, for example. And all these nonsense that eugenics started spouting in social theory. It's all coming from social theory again, isn't it? So I don't know how to it's all in the universities, it's all in the schools now. All we can do is encourage the young people we know to question things, and people of our generation, of your generation, if they know young grandchildren and stuff, they may just make sure that they can question things and come up with their own ideas and think about what pros and cons and all this, that, and the other. And it will save society that way. But I don't know how to save the universities or the, once these dogmas get involved.
Because unfortunately, they claim to advocate questioning everything and being critical. But I think many of us would consider that they're not doing that. They're either
No.
hypocritical or they're just dishonest.
Because they're introducing something that can't be criticised. So they say that science is. They will often say that science is socially constructed, or the Black Lives Matters might say, "Oh, it's constructed by white men who, who had their own interests at heart." So it's not. This even goes as far as undermining the United States by saying that because the founding fathers had slaves, or some of them did, that undermines the true nature of. This is all nonsense. Of course, it has nothing to do with arguing logical points or whether the Constitution of America, say, is good or bad or needs to be changed. It just promotes a sort of, you criticize the past to try and isolate it, and then you end up with dogmas which can't be challenged, and that's basically what is happening.
Right. Well, we are running out of time. Unfortunately, time always catches up with us. And I always say that we've raised some points here that I think we can profitably consider returning to. So, Denny, if that's all right, if you've nothing more to say for the moment, I'll just yeah, okay.
Well, I'd just like to say that I agree with James.
Yeah. Actually, you've made a number of points that your general thesis would be in agreement with James's, which is quite interesting.
Well, it's all, my views are on record now, so people can, criticize them. I'm not beyond criticism. I'd love criticism, but there we are. We haven't had time for.
I'll have to give a bit more thought to this, because I think it's all very interesting, and for my own part, I'm certainly willing to say that I agree with a lot of what you said at the present, but others perhaps I'm not. I'll have to study it in more detail. And I've been writing emails, exchanging emails with you for some months now, but I've never spoken to you face to face. Today is the first privilege.
This isn't my expertise, but it's an attempt to try and keep free society running while we do this criticism of Einstein and stuff. If we can't have a free society, all that's gone out the window as well. So
yes, quite so.
So basically, I do have the main interests of the group. That are my main, but basically, I just want to widen it so people can think about other issues.
Well, I if I may summarize myself, and thank you very much, James, because we will be hearing a lot more from you. I'd like to thank James very, very much for his very stimulating talk, irrespective of how much you agree immediately with what he's been saying or not. I think he's raised some very fundamental points. And for my part, I think it's very useful to have these talks every so often. I don't think it would be relevant for us to depart from, sort of fundamental physics every fortnight. But I think to have the odd talk now and again, where we're looking at philosophical aspects or tangentially at other aspects, in this case, looking at what happened in ancient Greece and how it's migrated or not to modern society, and effects on modern philosophy, and some of the things we criticize in that we believe perhaps that we don't actually have complete freedom, not only in science, because there's a dogma there which dare not be questioned, but maybe what seems to be emerging in very recent times now in society, which is harking back maybe to a dark age or to a totalitarian type system. So unfortunately, and this is something I think we ought to talk about now and again. Now, so the good news is actually James has agreed to come back to us. In fact, I think it might be the next time, and he'll be going more into fundamental physics, actually Newtonian science and so on. So this is really just a precursor of the sort of lecture that we might wish to have, because I did mention very briefly the sort of work that has been initiated with regard to electromagnetics and so on, and James actually has agreed to give a talk, as I say, in the future, maybe not too distant future, about that. It's a bit too early to consider that now, and I don't really know myself, because my involvement in this might be quite substantial or it might be minimal, but I'm happy to work with James on that. There are a few comments coming in, but we really don't have time Yeah, there's some even political type things there, but so the time has terminated now, unfortunately, and we've run out completely. But I'd like to express on behalf of the CNPS and all of you our thanks, our sincere thanks to James for having taken the trouble to come and give us this most stimulating talk. I do invite, I'd like to thank everybody in the green room and everybody in the media, the Facebook and the social media, for coming in and making contributions. And if you want to follow any of these aspects up, please feel free to do that and comment. Give us your comments and exchange the comments. Nothing but good can come of that. So we look forward to the next time. As I say, just keep an eye on the announcement. Provisionally, it will be James again speaking more on fundamental physics. We'll tell you about that nearer the date. So I wish you all, whatever part of the world you're in, a very good day. And thank you very much for your participation. I'm going to end the broadcast now. Good day.